A best-selling author delivers a forceful critique of the Trump administration in his book, What the Hell Do You Have to Lose? Trump's War on Civil Rights. Juan Williams denounces the president and accuses him of intentionally twisting history to fuel racial tensions for political gain.
Juan Williams is a civil rights historian and political analyst. He's a columnist for The Hill, all right, home team, and co-host of Fox News' The Five. Juan, thank you so much for being here.
What a pleasure.
All right, so just what's the basic overview of this book? I mean, what do people need to know? Why should they pull it off the shelves, or more realistically, probably download it off of Amazon? Because that's how I read
That's
it.
the way people read these days.
Yeah.
You know, what's so important here is that at this moment, racial division in the country plays into our politics. As we head into the midterms, for example, Buck, you guys are focused on exactly, will the Democrats be able to gain the majority in the House? Will they be able to challenge the Republican majority in the Senate? Voter suppression becomes a central issue. Who gets out to vote, especially in midterms? And when you start to think about this, you understand the racial undergirding of so much of that issue. It's one of the key issues if you go back in terms of the Voting Rights Act of '64 and coming forward to this day in terms of the court saying some of those provisions from the old Voting Rights Act no longer should apply. So when you start to think about race, it's not only voting rights, it's also dealing with Black Lives Matter. It's also dealing with what's going on in terms of housing in the country. And most Americans at this point think that, you know what, race relations are getting worse. President Trump, they disapprove of his handling of race. Incredibly, about half of Americans say the president is a racist, which is, you know, such a heavy label. I don't like it because I think it shuts down conversation. But it tells you something that half the country's willing to say that about our leader.
A lot more than half the media basically says the president is a racist
Right.
on a regular basis, so that's not all that surprising. I don't want to make this about the previous administration, but just for proper context, did you feel like the Obama administration, in its totality, over the 8 years, and then really in the handoff the Trump administration, was successful in moving race relations forward, was successful in racial healing? I mean, you brought up the notion of Black Lives Matter. I think a lot of people saw a surprising amount of racial division, particularly toward the latter part of the Obama administration. I just want to know what you thought about that.
Well, clearly the polls don't show that. I mean, what they show is that there was, for example, Black Lives Matter. We know what happened, Trayvon Martin all the way through Ferguson, Missouri and the like, that these episodes would erupt. And of course, with Obama, you had the famous, I guess, 3 people getting together after Professor...
the Beer Summit.
The Beer Summit. After that, professor up at Harvard was arrested by a white police officer, all that. So you have all those things popping up. I think we live in a society that has racial tension implicit in it, given our origins and the realities of racial division. But my point to you, Buck, was that in this administration, people perceive it as having worsened. And I find that so compelling because if you look at Charlottesville, and then the president saying find people on both sides with, you know, alt-right, neo-Nazis, white supremacists marching, or you come forward, even with the Obama thing, to go back to what you were talking about, his birther movement, where he was saying the first African-American president is not legitimate, and half of Trump voters to this day say Obama was not born in the United States. I think you then come to understand race is such a heavy weight in terms of this current administration, and his supporters are overwhelmingly white and male. That's the core of the Trump base when you look at the 35 to 45% that remain in place no matter what he does. So race, again, become a prominent feature of our political landscape.
So I think we focus a lot on things like his response after Charlottesville, on his, attacks of black NFL players, those sorts of cultural flashpoints.
Right.
What about on the policy front? What does the president's policy look like on civil rights?
Are we allowed to hug the host? Because that's the heart of the book. I think so many people get locked in to the whole business of, what did he say about Omarosa? He called her a dog. Or what did he say about LeBron James and Don Lemon? So dumb, he says, of LeBron James, he makes Don Lemon look smart.
Right.
And people get locked in, what did he say? What didn't he say? I think the policies that he is supporting are what's key. So I was talking to Buck a moment ago about voter suppression. So he's, after the 2016 race, he says, how could Hillary Clinton have beat me by 3 million votes in terms of the popular vote? This is a result of voter fraud. And so he creates a commission to look for voter fraud, brings in Krystal back from Kansas. But guess what? There is no voter fraud. The commission's disbanded. But what has continued is you see Republican majority state legislatures that are closing polling places, limiting hours for voting, making voter ID requirements all the more strict. And that, again, plays into the policy, that they don't say anything. Buck asked about something like racial tensions around Black Lives Matter. Before the Trump administration comes, there are consent decrees being put in place to try to heal between local communities, especially poor Black communities, and the police. The Trump administration pulls themselves back, even in terms of something where you had strong Republican support, which is criminal justice reform, trying to do something about high penalties for nonviolent drug crimes in the country. Trump administration comes in, they withdraw support, and that's going nowhere. So we can keep going, but I really appreciate the question because it gets away from the static and he's this
the
or he's
tweets
that.
and the comments.
Let's look at the actual policies and what's taking place. We could talk about education, we can talk about housing, but those are the ones that are at the top of my list, Krystal.
Juan, why do you think it is that I believe currently we're in the lowest recorded Black unemployment in the country, and I believe also lowest recorded Hispanic unemployment, although it's at the close to the very lowest.
Correct.
That doesn't seem to affect his approval numbers very much, if at all, in those communities. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think the predicate of the question is one that Trump would invite, because he says, whenever he's asked about the kind of static, like having Kanye West in the White House and all the rest, he says, hey, what about the unemployment rate? Historic low, therefore, all of this is nonsense talking about my racial attitudes. Of course, he doesn't say the unemployment rate for blacks was like at 17% under President Obama. When Obama comes in the height of the Great Recession, goes down to 7%, Buck. President Trump comes in, it goes down an additional point, and then he says historic lows, and it's all for me, for my credit. Well, people know that's ridiculous. Secondly, it's double the unemployment rate for whites, and the wealth gap continues. So we were talking with Krystal about actual policies, and you look at things like how this president says to federal contractors, oh, you know what? You don't have to adhere to these requirements in terms of what's your minority hiring, what's your hiring of women. That's too much regulation. I think that hurts the growth of the Black middle class.
What could President Trump realistically do to make inroads with the Black community, especially considering that there is an overwhelming media narrative that whenever the president has Kanye come to the White House, whenever the president does something, we hear about Charlottesville yet again. It feels a bit like they want to criticize the president for these issues, but they don't want to ever open up the possibility that maybe he is either taking a new approach, reforming some of his ideas, being more open-minded. What do you think, based on everything you've written about in this book, President Trump could do that would actually be positive?
Well, I think there's so much he could do. It's to me, it's like you would have to stop, I think, sort of playing to his base so aggressively and see himself as president of all the people, Buck. So that, you know, as we sit here this Monday morning, his policies on separating children at the border, for example, with the immigrants and the illegal immigrants in specific, I think is, you know, damaging to race relations in the country. I think a lot of people are alarmed by it. I think that if you stop and look at his policies with regard to something like education, again, you say, why are you pulling back in terms of trying to make sure that kids who are locked in by zip code to segregated and oftentimes inferior schools can get out of those schools and do a better job? But I think the heart and soul of it, to answer your question, is his approach is, what the hell do you have to lose? Black people live in these, I'm paraphrasing him, might as well live in Afghanistan. Their neighborhoods are so violent, trash-filled, no jobs. And you stop and you say, wait a second, Mr. President, you're focusing on the 20% of Black America that lives in poverty, disproportionately young, the kind of hip-hop crazy, you know, and oh, these people are going to mug you. What about the 40% of Black America that earns between $35,000 and $100,000? What about the additional 12% that earns between $100,000 and $200,000? These are people who are solidly middle-class Americans, strive to achieve the American dream despite the history of segregation and the reality of ongoing discrimination. Mr. President, this is about striving. This is about people who love America, who believe in the American dream. Why don't you plug into that? Your populist instincts not only serve white America, they could serve Black America.
But doesn't he think that they do? Sorry,
but they don't. But they don't, obviously, when you look and see how he will, in fact, belittle Black people. We're talking about not just the Omarosas, but remember, he was so hard on Congresswoman Maxine Waters, one of his big critics. He said extraordinarily low intelligence. In so many Black minds, Bucks, that plays to racial stereotypes.
He says lock Hillary up.
He's
mean about a lot of people. Sorry, Krystal, go
Let
ahead.
me ask one. Fox News, your network, the lines between Fox News and this White House are blurry at best.
Blurry? I think they're joined
They don't
at,
exist.
Right,
I mean,
right,
they
right.
are joined at the hip. And Fox News perpetuates a lot of the cultural flashpoints that you are talking about here.
Right.
What is it like being a person of color on that network?
Well, I think it's important because for me, it means that I'm inside that bubble. So I think when people get locked into one way of thinking or another, sometimes they lose sight or the perspective of other people. And it's so easy then to, I think, put people who have different kind of thinking or different kind of life in a bubble and say, oh, those people are so different, they're the other, or they're threatening. So for me, it's the opportunity.
Do you feel like you can change minds there?
Yeah, I think people listen, and obviously we're all in a business. Media is a business, so the audience, it's not that they dislike me; it's just they disagree with me, and I have the opportunity to make my case. So oftentimes I get run over, or if I'm not prepared, I will get crushed. But my voice is there; no one's telling me what to say, and I think it's so important in this juncture when we're so politically polarized to have actual conversation. And I think Fox makes actual conversation, including a dissenting voice, available to the viewers.
Do you express concerns to, the higher ups there about that non-existent line between the White House and the network and how it's basically become a propaganda network?
Well, I don't agree with that, but it's above my pay grade. Let me just say that where I am allowed to or have voice is with my colleagues. So with fellow hosts, when they say things I think are wrong or even repugnant, I am clear about my feelings. It doesn't make me the most popular boy in school, but I think it's pretty clear.
Do you want to give an example?
No, I think that's best left unsaid, but I think it's so obvious because it's such a point of controversy in the media world. But again, I think there's the opportunity to play to your base and to belittle others, to make others into the threat. I think that's in answer to what Buck was asking me, Krystal, I think that when the president says, what the hell do you have to lose? He's not even talking to black people about bad neighborhoods and democratic political dominance of big cities. I think he's speaking to a white audience about the threat from the other, that these black people will come, they'll mug you on the street, or they'll send their kids into your school, or they're coming in to take your jobs, all that. I think he positions himself as a hero standing in the breach against the approaching barbarians. And on a racial basis, it foments racial divides in our society by talking to us about each other, not as fellow Americans, but as a threat. Oh, these people are going to come and rely more on social entitlement programs, drive up your taxes and all the rest, or these people are coming in illegally. If it's not the MS-13 killing white people, it's these black guys, these gangbangers. I think it just creates more fear of each other. And on Fox, what I try to do is pierce that and say,
Juan,
hey,
we have to have you back here so we
people.
can continue this discussion, all these different issues. We wish you good luck with the book.
Thank you so
Well,
much.
thanks.
Congratulations on the book.
And please read my column in The Hill.
Absolutely.
We will do
Big
that
plug for the
religiously.
column@thehill.com, everybody.
Thank you, Juan.
The president's new comments on Christine Blasey Ford. Potential 2020 candidates are booking their plane tickets to Iowa. And the first polling for 2020 is officially out.
And Kevin McCarthy's family is under fire for benefiting from a U.S. program for minorities, despite disputes on that ancestry. Team Rising gives their take right after this.